A poor girl let a man and his daughter stay for one night, not knowing he was a millionaire cowboy. The wind had a voice that night, long, low, and sorrowful, as if the land itself were mourning. Snow fell in thick sheets over the Wyoming frontier, burying the world in silence. Beneath the ridge, a faint orange glow pulsed weakly through the storm, a lantern in the window of a lonely log cabin. Inside, Nora Brooks sat hunched near the hearth, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She stirred the last spoonful of beans in a dented tin pot, the sound of the wooden spoon clinking softly in the dim room. Every gust outside made the walls groan. Her pantry shelves were nearly bare now, a half bag of flour, a jar of salt, and 2 candles left. But it wasn't hunger that hurt most. It was the quiet. The kind of quiet that stretches on for months when a soul has no one left to talk to. She lifted her eyes to the small portrait nailed above the mantel, her parents smiling faintly in faded sepia. "Guess it's just me now," she whispered. "But I'm still standing." The wind suddenly shifted, whistling down the chimney. Then came a sound that froze her blood. A knock. Art. Urgent. Followed by a muffled shout, a man's voice. "Please? Anybody home? Help us." Nora's chair scraped across the floor as she stood. Her hand went straight to her rifle propped near the door. Out here, knocks after dark meant trouble more often than not. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. The voice came again, strained and desperate. "Please, there's a child with me." That stopped her cold. A child? Cautiously, she slid back the wooden bolt and cracked the door open. The wind roared in, biting at her face. Through the swirl of snow stood a tall man, his hat rimmed in frost, his coat thick with ice. In his arms, he cradled a little girl wrapped in a velvet cloak, her small face pale as milk. "Please, ma'am," he said again, his lips trembling. "We've been out here since sundown. Horse fell on the ridge. The girl's freezing." Nora took one look at the child's limp hand and threw the door open wide. "Get in before you both freeze to death." They stumbled inside. The man lowered the girl gently onto the rug near the fire while Nora slammed the door against the storm. He dropped to one knee, rubbing warmth into the girl's fingers. Nora rushed to the kettle, poured what little hot water she had into a tin cup, and pressed it into his hands. "Here. Give her this." The man obeyed, holding the cup to the girl's lips. After a few shaky sips, some color returned to her cheeks. When he looked up at Nora, she finally saw his face, roughened by cold but strong, with deep-set eyes that spoke of burden and distance. "You saved us," he murmured. She shook her head. "No. You saved her. I just opened a door." For a long moment they said nothing. Only the crackle of the fire filled the silence. Then Nora's eyes drifted over their clothes. The man's coat, fine wool tailored. His boots, polished leather, now caked with snow. The girl's gloves, white silk, embroidered with gold thread. Not the kind of things seen on travelers or ranch hands. "You two don't look like folks from around here," she said softly. He gave a tired smile, avoiding her eyes. "We're a long way from home." Nora studied him but didn't press further. "Well, you can thaw out here. I've got some beans on the fire and there's a cot you can use." "Ma'am, I couldn't." "You could," she cut him off firmly. "And you will. That child needs warmth more than I need privacy." For the first time since stepping inside, a flicker of relief crossed his face. "Thank you, truly." Nora turned back to the fire, tossing another stick of wood into the flames. "No need to thank me. Out here it's help or die. That's just the way of it." The man removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with gray. "Name's Daniel Briggs," he said quietly. "And this is my daughter, Annie." Nora nodded once. "Well, Daniel Briggs, welcome to my home. I'm Nora Brooks. It ain't fancy, but it'll do till morning." He looked around the small cabin, one bed, one table, one chair, and a few hand-sewn curtains fluttering in the draft. Still, there was something warm about it. Something pure. "Miss Brooks," he said after a moment, "if there's any way I can repay you." "You can start by not letting that little girl catch her death," Nora replied, kneeling to tuck another blanket over Annie. Daniel smiled faintly. "Understood." Outside, the storm screamed on, a wall of white and wind. But inside, the cabin glowed with firelight and the soft sound of a child's breathing. And as Nora sat back in her chair, watching the stranger and his daughter sleep, she had the uneasy feeling that this night would change her life forever. Morning came in a dull gray hush. The wind still screamed outside, but the snow had grown so thick it muted the world. No birds, no horses, not even the crack of frozen trees. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, casting a trembling light over the rough-hewn walls. Nora Brooks stirred from her chair, her back stiff from a sleepless night. Across the room, Daniel Briggs lay beside his daughter, Annie, both wrapped in quilts she'd loaned them. The child's face, once pale with frost, now glowed faintly pink in the firelight. Nora stood quietly, adjusting the pot on the coals. She poured a thin bit of coffee, the last she had, and stared out the frosted window. The world beyond was nothing but white. There'd be no leaving today. A faint rustle behind her. "Morning," Daniel's voice said, soft but low like thunder on the horizon. She turned. He was sitting up now, his hair mussed, his coat draped across his shoulders. Without the snow and storm masking him, Nora saw him clearly for the first time. A man not young but not old either, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a look of weariness that went deeper than travel. "Morning," she replied, pouring another cup. "Coffee's weak but it's hot." He accepted it gratefully, their fingers brushing as she handed him the tin mug. A strange warmth flickered in that touch, one that lingered longer than either expected. He took a sip, winced, then smiled faintly. "You weren't kidding. That's the thinnest coffee I've ever had." Nora raised a brow, half smiling herself. "Guess you're used to better?" "Guess I am," he admitted, glancing around at the small cabin, the patched curtains, the simple furniture, the little stack of books beside her bed. "But I'll take this over a hotel any day." From the corner, a sleepy voice piped up. "Papa, is it morning?" Annie sat up, her golden curls spilling from her bonnet. She blinked at Nora shyly. "It's morning, sweetheart," Daniel said gently. "You warm enough?" The girl nodded, smiling. "Miss Nora took care of me." Nora chuckled softly. "I just fed the fire. The rest was your papa's doing." As the three shared a simple breakfast of beans and bread, Nora noticed how carefully Daniel handled every bite, polite, deliberate, as though he were used to fine tables and servants. Annie, though cheerful, used words that didn't quite belong to a rancher's child: tea service, pianoforte, carriage. Each little slip made Nora tilt her head, wondering who these people really were. "Your girl talks mighty fancy," she said with a teasing grin. Daniel looked mildly embarrassed. "Her mother was particular about manners." "Oh," Nora said, keeping her voice soft. "She's gone," he replied, staring into the fire. Silence settled for a moment, heavy but respectful. Nora didn't pry. She knew loss when she saw it. After breakfast, Daniel insisted on helping with chores. Together, they stepped outside into the bitter cold to split wood. The snow reached their knees and the wind burned their faces raw. But Daniel swung the axe like a man who'd known hard work before, not just wealth. "You swing that like you mean it," Nora called over the wind. He grinned. "A man learns a few things owning a cattle spread." She stopped mid-lift. "You own a spread?" He shrugged lightly. "Something like that. Down near Silver Creek." "Silver Creek?" she echoed. "That's good land. Fine cattle country." He didn't answer right away. "Used to be," he finally said, eyes distant. "Now it's just a place I left behind." Nora studied him for a long second. The fine coat, the strong shoulders, the way he looked away whenever talk turned toward home. There was a story there, buried deep as the snowdrifts outside. By dusk, the storm only worsened. The wind howled and shook the shutters like a beast trying to get in. Nora barred the door and threw another log on the fire. Annie sat by her feet, humming softly as she braided a strip of cloth into her doll's hair. Daniel sat across the hearth, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Miss Brooks," he said after a long silence, "you live alone out here all year?" She nodded. "Since my folks passed. I tried keeping the ranch running, but the bank took it when the drought hit. What's left of their land sits under the snow somewhere out there." He frowned. "You stayed on this land anyway?" "This cabin's all I've got," she said simply. "It's enough." Daniel looked down at his hands. "You've got more than most. You've got courage." She chuckled softly. "Courage don't fill a stomach, Mr. Briggs." "No," he said quietly. "But it fills the heart. And that's harder to come by." The fire popped between them and for a while neither spoke. Annie fell asleep curled up in her quilt, her small hand resting on Nora's skirt. Daniel's gaze softened as he watched the two of them, the mountain woman with kind eyes and the daughter he loved more than life. Later, when Nora offered him her bed again, he refused. "You've already done enough." She crossed her arms. "And you've got a child. Don't argue with me, Mr. Briggs." He smiled faintly, the first real smile she'd seen on him, and surrendered. "Yes, ma'am." As Nora settled into the chair by the fire, she glanced once more at Daniel and his little girl. The The storm outside might have trapped them there for another day or more. But in her heart she didn't mind. For the first time in a long while the cabin didn't feel so empty. And as Daniel watched the firelight flicker across Nora's face, he couldn't help but think, maybe this storm wasn't a curse after all. Maybe it was Providence. By the third sunrise there was no sunrise at all, only a dim gray light pressed behind the clouds. The blizzard showed no mercy. Snowdrifts climbed nearly to the cabin windows, and the world outside had vanished into a cold, endless blur. Inside, the fire had become the center of their small world, glowing, snapping, and holding back the wilderness beyond. Nora Brooks moved quietly around the cabin, adding logs to the hearth, mending a tear in Annie's cloak and humming softly to herself. Daniel Briggs watched her from his seat near the fire, his arms resting on his knees. She moved with purpose, no wasted steps, no pretense, just steady strength. And yet, there was gentleness in every motion, especially when she leaned down to tuck Annie's blanket tighter or brushed ash from the floor with the side of her hand. He wasn't used to that kind of strength. In the cities back east, he'd met women adorned with lace and jewels, their smiles measured, their kindness conditional. But this woman, this poor, mountain-born Nora Brooks, gave freely without calculation or fear. When she noticed his eyes on her, she tilted her head with a faint smile. "You staring at me for a reason, Mr. Briggs?" He cleared his throat, caught off guard. "Just admiring how well you keep this place running. You make it look easy." "Nothing's easy," she said, sitting across from him. "You just get used to hard." He nodded slowly, then leaned forward, holding his hands out to the flames. "Where I come from, folks talk about courage like it's something you can buy, medals, titles, big speeches. But out here it's quiet, simple. I think that's the truest kind." She smiled faintly. "Careful, Mr. Briggs. You talk like a man who's seen both sides." He looked into the fire, his eyes darkening. "I have." Outside, the wind roared again, shaking the walls. Nora rose to steady the window latch. The sound of the storm reminded her of every night she'd sat alone, listening to the world rage while she waited for dawn that never came soon enough. When she turned back, Daniel had stood and was helping gather her kindling from beside the door. "You don't have to do that," she said. He smiled. "You've done enough for me. Let me work a little." She studied him as he split small pieces with her hatchet. For all his fine coat and polished boots, he swung the blade like a man who'd done his share of labor. His hands were rough, not pampered, the kind that knew reins, rope, and long rides. "You've worked a ranch before?" she said quietly. He hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yes, ma'am. Grew up around stock. Still own a few head, I suppose." "You suppose?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. A small smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I left it behind." Nora felt a flicker of curiosity but didn't press. Whatever he'd left behind, it still lingered in him like a shadow. The hours stretched long that day. Annie played on the rug, humming tunes her mother had once taught her. Nora baked a small pan of cornbread from the last of her meal, the sweet smell filling the cabin. Daniel offered to help with the firewood, the cooking, even sweeping the floor. She'd never had a man in her home before, not since her father's passing, and the sight of him moving about her small cabin stirred something strange in her chest. That night, the three of them sat close as the storm battered the door. Nora read from one of her tattered books, The Pilgrim's Journey, her voice calm and steady. Annie listened, eyes wide. Daniel leaned against the wall, half lost in thought, half lost in the sound of Nora's voice. When Nora finished, Annie yawned and climbed into her father's lap. He rocked her gently, humming low under his breath. "She's lucky," Nora said softly, "to have a father who sings." Daniel smiled. "Her mother used to. I just try to remember the tunes." Something heavy passed between them then, the shared weight of loss, of missing people they loved. When Annie finally fell asleep, Daniel laid her on the cot and turned back toward Nora. She was still by the fire, her face lit gold by the flames, her eyes soft and thoughtful. He hesitated. "Miss Brooks, can I ask you something?" She nodded. "You can try." He smiled faintly. "Why do you stay out here? Most folks would have left after losing so much." Her gaze drifted to the window where the storm beat hard against the glass. "Because this land's all I got left that still feels like home. My folks worked it, bled for it. If I leave, it's like they never were." Daniel swallowed, nodding slowly. "I know that feeling." "You do." He looked into the fire. "When my wife passed, everything we built together, the ranch, the money, the business, it all felt empty. I couldn't stand to see it anymore. So I left. Took Annie and started riding west, hoping to find I don't know. Something real again. Nora's voice softened. And you found a snowstorm instead. He chuckled quietly. Seems so. Then his eyes lifted to hers. But maybe the storm wasn't such bad luck after all. The air between them warmed, not from the fire but from something unspoken. Nora dropped her gaze, hiding a small smile. You should get some rest, Mr. Briggs. He lingered a moment longer before nodding. Good night, Miss Brooks. She watched him lie down beside Annie, his arm protectively around the girl. The cabin grew quiet except for the hiss of the fire. And as Nora sat there, staring into the flames, she felt a strange comfort, one she hadn't known in years. The storm still howled, but for the first time, it didn't sound lonely. On the fourth morning, silence filled the cabin, not the kind that came from fear but from peace. The wind had died. The storm had finally spent itself. Nora woke to light, real sunlight, spilling through the small window panes, turning the frost to glitter. The world outside was a sea of white hills, gleaming under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped quietly to the window. Well, would you look at that, she whispered. Behind her, Daniel stirred awake. Sunshine? He asked groggily. More than enough to melt a man's heart, she said with a smile. He rose and joined her by the window. Together they looked out at the glimmering valley, trees bowed heavy with snow, smoke rising thin from the chimney, the world bright and clean as if God himself had washed it new. For the first time in days, Nora saw Daniel's face clearly in the daylight. His features were strong, but there was something haunted behind his eyes, the kind of look a man carried when he'd lost too much too soon. I'd near forgotten how pretty the world can be, he said softly. Storms have a way of making us forget, she answered. Then one morning they just stop. He nodded slowly, his gaze still on the horizon. Sometimes it's not just the weather that needs clearing. Nora studied him, her brow furrowing slightly. What do you mean? But before he could answer, little Annie woke with a sleepy yawn. Papa? She mumbled. He turned at once, kneeling beside her cot. Morning, sweetheart. Look, the sun's come back. Annie smiled weakly and reached for Nora's hand. Miss Nora, are we gonna go outside today? Nora laughed softly. We will, soon as it's safe to walk without sinking to our necks. Annie giggled and Daniel smiled, a real one this time. Later that morning, after breakfast of leftover cornbread and coffee, Daniel insisted on helping shovel a path from the cabin to the well. He used Nora's old iron spade, working with steady, powerful strokes. Nora watched from the porch, holding Annie close under a blanket. There was something peaceful about seeing a man's strength used for care rather than destruction, the kind of work her father used to do before the world grew mean and lonely. When Daniel paused to rest, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill, she called out, You handle that spade like you were born to it. He smiled. Maybe I was. My pa used to say a man's worth is measured in the tracks he leaves behind, sweat, not gold. She nodded thoughtfully. Then he was a wise man. Daniel leaned on the shovel, his breath fogging in the air. He was, until I forgot everything he taught me. Something in his tone made her step closer. What happened, Daniel? He hesitated, and then sighed, setting the shovel aside. You've been kind to me. Guess you deserve to know what kind of man you took in. They went inside where the fire still burned low. Annie sat quietly playing with a small carved horse Daniel had whittled for her. He stood by the hearth, staring into the flames. Back east I had a ranch near Wichita. Big place. Money, cattle, workers. My wife, Lila, she was the heart of it. Everything I did was for her. His voice cracked slightly and Nora didn't interrupt. One spring fever hit the valley. Took her fast. Took half my men too. I tried to keep the ranch going but it wasn't the same. Every fence I mended, every horse I saddled, it just reminded me she wasn't there. I drank too much. Sold off land. Pushed everyone away. One day I woke up and realized Annie deserved better than the ghost I'd become. So I saddled a wagon and rode west. Nora's eyes softened. You didn't run away, Daniel. You were trying to start over. He looked up at her, grief shadowing his face. Then why does it still feel like I'm running? For a long moment, only the crackle of fire filled the silence. Then Nora spoke quietly, because sometimes it takes more than distance to heal. Sometimes it takes another soul who understands. Daniel met her gaze, really met it, and in that instant the air between them changed. It wasn't pity or gratitude. It was understanding, born from the same soil of loss and endurance. He took a step closer. You lost someone too, didn't you? Nora nodded slowly. My husband. 6 winters ago. He was hunting when a snowbank gave way. Found him 3 days later, half buried in the ridge. After that, I just stayed. The land was all I had left. Daniel's eyes glistened. I'm sorry, Nora. She gave a small, sad smile. Don't be. Grief's just proof we loved well. For a while neither spoke. The fire popped, and outside, sunlight turned the snow to glittering crystals. Then Daniel said quietly, maybe that's why the storm brought me here. She tilted her head. What do you mean? Maybe we both needed reminding that life doesn't stop, even when hearts do. Her lips parted as if to answer, but the words caught in her throat. She just nodded. That afternoon they ventured outside with Annie. The air was crisp and bright, and their breath came in soft clouds. Daniel helped Nora fetch water from the well, his hand brushing hers as he passed the bucket. A small spark ran through her at the touch, unexpected and uninvited. When she looked up, he was already watching her, a faint warmth in his eyes that made her heart stumble. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them said enough. Something was changing, quietly, like thaw beneath the snow. That night, as Annie slept, Daniel sat by the fire sharpening a small knife, and Nora mended a tear in his coat. He glanced at her, his voice low. When this snow clears for good, I'll have to move on. Her hands stilled. Of course, she said softly. You've got a life to return to. But as she spoke, her chest tightened. He nodded, but there was no certainty in it. Maybe. Or maybe I'll find a new one. When she finally met his eyes, she saw it, that flicker of possibility, fragile and frightening but real. And for the first time in 6 long winters, Nora Brooks dared to wonder, what if the storm hadn't come to take but to give? The morning after the storm cleared, Nora woke to a sound she hadn't heard in months, hammering. Rhythmic, steady, confident. She stepped out onto the porch, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Daniel was in the yard, coat off, sleeves rolled to his elbows, repairing the broken fence that circled her small corral. His breath fogged in the cold air as he drove a nail clean through a warped plank. What are you doing? She called, half smiling. He didn't look up. Fixing what needs fixing. That fence has been leaning all winter. I was gonna get to it come spring. He gave a dry laugh. Spring's a long way off, Miss Brooks. Might as well make her stand proud now. Nora folded her arms, leaning against the doorframe. The man worked like someone who'd done this all his life, precise, patient, with a strength that didn't need proving. Annie sat nearby, bundled in her cloak, holding the small bucket of nails and humming softly. Nora's chest warmed at the sight, a father and daughter working side by side as if they'd been part of this homestead forever. When he finally paused to rest, Nora brought him a tin cup of coffee. You didn't have to do all that, she said quietly. Daniel took the cup with a nod. You took in 2 strangers and kept us alive through a storm. Least I can do is make sure your fence don't fall on you. She smiled. You've got a way of turning debt into kindness, Mr. Briggs. He chuckled softly. Where I come from, debts are best paid in sweat. By noon, the corral stood straight again, and Daniel offered to help muck out the small barn. Nora hesitated, she wasn't used to another set of hands around here. But when he lifted the heavy planks with ease and hummed while he worked, the cabin suddenly didn't feel quite so lonely. Inside, Annie helped Nora prepare stew. The little girl was curious, bright-eyed, asking questions about every jar and spice she found. What's this one? Annie asked, pointing at a tin. That's sage, Nora said, smiling. Good for stew, bad for pie. Annie giggled. My mama used to make pies. Papa says hers were the best. Nora paused, glancing toward the barn window where Daniel was working. I bet she was, she said softly. When they sat down to eat, the air felt easy for the first time. Daniel bowed his head before the meal, his voice low but steady. For warmth, for food, and for those who open their doors to strangers, we give thanks. Nora's heart gave a small tremor. No man had ever prayed at her table since her husband passed. The words filled the silence like music. As days passed, Daniel didn't leave. Each morning he found some new task, mending the roof, fixing the squeaky door, chopping enough firewood to last the winter. When Nora protested, he only smiled and said, idle hands make for restless minds. She began to look forward to those mornings, to his voice outside, to Annie's laughter echoing near the well, to the smell of coffee brewing while snow melted on the porch. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold, Nora stood watching Daniel saddle her old mare. Didn't think she'd let anyone else ride her, Nora said. She's gentle, Daniel replied, patting the mare's neck. Just needed someone to remind her she's strong. Nora smiled faintly. Sounds like someone else I know. He looked up, meeting her eyes, a long silent moment that neither dared to break. Then he cleared his throat. I was thinking I could ride into town tomorrow. Pick up supplies, see if the road's clear. Her heart sank, though she tried to hide it. Course. You should. I'm sure Annie's missing a real bed. Daniel hesitated. Maybe. But she's been sleeping sounder here than she has in months. Nora looked down at her hands. You don't owe me anything, Daniel. I know, he said softly. That's why I want to stay. The words hung in the cold air like a confession. She didn't answer right away. Just turned toward the horizon where the last light was fading. You can stay as long as you need, she whispered. He smiled, the kind that reached his eyes this time. Then I'll stay till the fence breaks again. The next few days passed like a dream. Daniel taught Annie how to brush the mare's mane. He showed Nora how to reinforce the barn beams, and she cooked hearty suppers that made them all laugh around the table. Each evening, as the fire crackled low, Nora found herself stealing glances at Daniel, at the way he rested his hands, the calm in his voice, the quiet steadiness that filled her home. And sometimes when she caught him watching her too, neither looked away fast enough. But one night, when the sky outside turned black and the wind whispered low again, Nora couldn't sleep. She stepped out to the porch, pulling her shawl close. Daniel was there too, sitting on the steps, staring at the stars. Couldn't rest? She asked softly. He shook his head. Too quiet. She sat beside him. For a while they said nothing, just listened to the stillness. Finally Daniel spoke. You ever think maybe the Lord puts people in our path for a reason? Nora's voice was barely above a whisper. I used to. Then I stopped expecting reasons. He turned to her, eyes searching hers. Maybe you shouldn't stop. Because I can't shake the feeling that the storm didn't push me here by accident. Her breath caught, but she didn't speak. The air between them was warm despite the cold. Then quietly he said, You saved me, Nora. Not just from the snow. She looked away, her heart pounding. You don't owe me words like that. He smiled faintly. I don't say what I owe. I say what I mean. And in the silence that followed, something shifted, not loud or sudden, but deep and certain, like the earth settling after a long winter. By the time dawn came, the poor girl who'd once lived alone in that quiet cabin realized something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The week after the storm ended was quiet, too quiet. The snow had begun to melt into the earth, leaving behind patches of mud and the scent of new grass. Nora found herself almost forgetting that Daniel and Annie were ever meant to be guests. They felt like part of the land now, as if their laughter and footsteps belonged to the cabin itself. But one morning, everything changed. Nora was splitting kindling near the barn when she saw a rider approaching from the ridge, a tall man on a black stallion moving fast. Daniel saw him too. His jaw tightened. Who's that? Nora asked, shielding her eyes from the glare. Daniel's expression darkened. Someone from the life I thought I'd left behind. The rider stopped just short of the yard, dust swirling around his boots as he dismounted. He was dressed fine, long coat, polished boots, and a gleaming silver badge pinned to his chest. Briggs, the man called, tipping his hat. Been looking all over for you. Nora froze. Briggs. He hadn't said much about his name, but she suddenly remembered how he'd said it that first night, quietly, like it carried weight. The man strode forward with a broad grin. You near gave half of Kansas a scare when you vanished, Daniel. Folks thought you were dead. Daniel sighed, resting a hand on his hip. I was close enough. Nora set down her axe slowly. You know him? The stranger turned to her with a polite smile. Ma'am, I surely do. I'm Frank Murdoch, foreman of the Briggs Ranch out near Wichita Falls. Nora's heart stopped cold. Briggs Ranch? She whispered. Frank nodded. Biggest spread this side of the river. Belongs to this man right here. He clapped Daniel on the shoulder. Or used to, till he up and disappeared like a ghost. Nora looked from one to the other, her stomach twisting. You're a ranch owner? Daniel's eyes found hers, full of something between shame and apology. Was. Not anymore. Frank laughed. Was. Hell, the place is still yours, Daniel. You're sittin' on more cattle and coin than any man west of the Mississippi. You could buy this whole valley twice over. Nora stepped back. Buy this valley? Her mind reeled. The man who had fixed her fence, eaten her stew, slept by her fire, had a fortune waiting somewhere out there. Daniel's voice was low. That's enough, Frank. But the foreman didn't stop. Everyone's been worried sick. The bank sent letters, the sheriff even wrote out. You had folks thinking you'd gone crazy after Lila passed. Daniel's jaw tightened, his voice suddenly like stone. I did go crazy. That's why I left. And I don't plan on going back. Frank blinked. You can't mean that. There's business to handle and your name. My name doesn't buy peace, Daniel cut in sharply. It never did. Nora stood frozen, heart pounding. You lied, she whispered. Daniel turned toward her, eyes pleading. Nora, I never lied. I just didn't tell you everything. I didn't want to be that man anymore, the one who measured his worth in land and gold. She shook her head, voice trembling. You let me think you were just a drifter. You sat at my table like you had nothing. I did have nothing, he said quietly. Money couldn't keep my wife alive. Couldn't make me a father Annie could be proud of. It sure couldn't fix what was broken inside me. Frank looked between them, uncomfortable. I'll wait by the horses. He tipped his hat and backed away. Nora crossed her arms tightly, trying to steady her breath. So what happens now? You ride off to your big ranch, leave this little cabin behind like it never mattered? Daniel stepped closer. You think that's what I want? Her eyes glistened. What else could you want, Daniel Briggs? You belong to a world I can't even picture. I've got a leaky roof and 2 hens that won't lay. He reached out, his voice rough. And yet you gave me something no man with 100 acres could buy, peace. Home. A place where the noise in my head stopped for the first time since Lila died. Nora's throat tightened, but she looked away. You can't say things like that. Not when you'll be gone tomorrow. He paused, then said softly, What if I don't leave? She turned to him, eyes wide. I came here a broken man, he continued. You and Annie made me remember what it feels like to live. Maybe I don't want the old life back. Maybe the one I want is standing right in front of me, chopping wood and pretending she doesn't care. Nora's lip trembled, torn between laughter and tears. You don't belong here, Daniel. He smiled faintly. Funny, I was just about to say the same thing to you. For a long, aching moment, neither spoke. Only the wind moved, stirring the snow at their feet. Then Annie's voice broke the silence. Papa, Miss Nora, are you mad at each other? Nora knelt and gathered the girl into her arms, shaking her head. No, sweetheart. We're just figuring things out. Daniel's voice softened. We're trying to decide where home really is. Nora looked up, meeting his gaze through tears, and in that quiet moment she realized the truth. She didn't care about money. She cared about him. But her pride wouldn't let the words come. Not yet. That night, as Daniel packed his saddlebag, Nora sat by the fire, her hands trembling in her lap. If he left, the silence would return, heavier than before. But if he stayed, her heart might never be the same again. And for the first time since she buried her husband, Nora Brooks feared something more than loneliness, falling in love again. The dawn that followed was pale and still, a quiet so deep it felt sacred. Frost shimmered on the porch rail, and a thin line of smoke rose from the chimney. Inside, Nora sat by the fire, hands clasped tight, her heart caught between hope and heartbreak. She'd heard Daniel saddling the horses before sunrise. Heard the jingle of stirrups and the murmur of his voice to Annie. She hadn't stepped outside. She couldn't. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like goodbye. Finally the door opened. Daniel stood there, hat in hand, face shadowed by the morning light. Annie clung to his side, her little fingers gripping his coat. I came to say thank you, he said softly. Nora nodded, eyes fixed on the flames. No need. There's need, he said. You saved me when I didn't want saving. She looked up then, and the sight of him, tall, steady, heartbreak written clear in his eyes, made her chest ache. You'll go back east, she whispered. To your land, your people. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked slowly to the table, the same table where they'd eaten together, where he'd prayed, where laughter had filled a home that hadn't known it in years. I rode out last night after you went to bed, he said finally. Thought I'd see if I could find peace on the road. He paused, voice low. I didn't. Nora frowned. What do you mean? He took a step closer. I made it as far as the ridge before I realized something. Everything I thought I lost, I found again in that cabin. Her lips parted, but no words came. He knelt slightly so he could meet her eyes. Money can buy 1,000 acres, Nora. But it can't buy the feeling I get when you smile at me over a pot of stew. Or when Annie laughs because you taught her how to braid her hair. She blinked hard, tears glistening. Daniel? He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small weathered pouch. He poured its contents onto the table, a few gold coins dulled by time. That's all I took when I left Wichita, he said quietly. A man could live comfortable on it for a year, maybe 2. I've had it sitting in my saddlebag all this time. But you know what, Nora? She shook her head, whispering, "What? I don't want to spend another day living comfortable. I want to live right." He slid the pouch toward her. "This ain't charity. It's partnership. I want to help you fix the barn, buy a new plow, plant your garden again come spring. You let me stay and I'll make this place a home worth staying in, for all of us." Nora stared at the coins, then at him. "You mean, you'd stay? Here?" He smiled softly. "If you'll have me." The room went silent, save for the crackle of the fire and Annie's gentle breathing. Nora rose slowly from her chair. "Daniel Briggs," she said, her voice trembling, "you could buy a mansion in any town between here and San Antonio." He grinned faintly. "But not this. Not you." Her throat tightened. "And what if I say no?" He shrugged lightly. "Then I'll still leave that gold and wish you more blessings than I deserve. But I hope you won't." For a long moment she said nothing. Her eyes glistened as she looked around the small cabin, the patched roof, the scarred table, the life she'd built alone. And then her gaze returned to him, this man who had walked into her home a stranger and somehow rebuilt the parts of her heart she thought were gone for good. "You stay," she whispered. "But only if you understand something." He tilted his head. "What's that?" "I don't need your gold," she said softly. "Just your hands, your heart, and your word you'll never ride out without saying goodbye again." Daniel's smile deepened, slow, certain, like dawn spreading over snow. "You have all three, Nora Brooks." Before she could speak again, he closed the distance between them. His hand brushed her cheek, rough and warm, and then his lips found hers, gentle, steady, tasting of promise. Outside, the wind stirred softly, carrying the scent of pine and thawing earth. Annie peeked from behind the table, giggling. "Does this mean we're staying, Papa?" Daniel laughed, his arms still around Nora. "It means we're home, sweetheart." Spring came early that year. The barn stood straight again, painted fresh with Daniel's steady hand. The corral brimmed with new horses, and laughter filled the yard every evening as Annie chased chickens under Nora's watchful eye. Sometimes travelers would ride by and ask about the ranch. They'd see the sign by the gate, burned into a wooden plank with steady care. Brooks and Briggs Homestead. And they'd hear rumors that the man who ran it had once been a millionaire. But those who met him, those who saw the quiet way he looked at the woman beside him, knew he'd traded gold for something far rarer. A love built on kindness. A home built by hands, not money. A life richer than any fortune.